David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
This is a fantastic and stunning story, and it relates to the now, I guess I'll say 6 or more allegations of sexual assault against the Alabama Republican Senate candidate Roy Moore. When there are sexual assault allegations generally, you always have this faction that likes to say the allegations are made up. We can't believe the allegations. But there are also some who are more specific, and they say, it's not that the women aren't credible as a general thing. It's that anyone who wants to hurt a politician can go to the media and say, so-and-so assaulted me, just to get stories written about them to hurt them politically. And the argument is from some, particularly on the right, that the media, whoever the media is, are just so eager to publish this type of story that they will do it on the say-so of one alleged victim without actually trying to fact check or do background research. And the truth is that when the Washington Post published the stories of women who said we were sexually assaulted by Roy Moore, many right-wingers did exactly this. They were very quickly writing it off as, oh, it's the Washington Post doing a political hit piece to hurt Roy Moore in the election. The right-wingers pointing out, oh, Amazon or Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post and he's a big left-winger. I don't even know if that's true, actually. But in any case, saying you can't trust the reports because the Washington Post is not really researching this stuff. They're publishing nonsense. They've not done their due diligence to figure out, are these women maybe telling the truth or are these women just making stuff up? And this is where it gets great, okay? Remember this guy, James O'Keefe? He's the sort of right-wing troll provocateur who likes to do undercover recordings to try to sting different people. And so often his sting attempts completely backfire. He did this at Acorn. He did this with Planned Parenthood. There's a very long list of them. And many of them have absolutely horribly backfired on him. He's connected to this organization, Project Veritas. And what Project Veritas and James O'Keefe did was send a woman to the Washington Post to lie, to straight up lie and say, Roy Moore sexually assaulted me. And the idea was, if the Washington Post publishes this, then Project Veritas can come out and say, look, this woman went to the Washington Post, made up this story about Roy Moore, and they published it. And it would sort of serve to discredit all of the previous accusers of Roy Moore. So what did the woman do? She got in touch with the Washington Post. She had a meeting with them. And in that meeting, she said, I was 15 years old. I had a sexual relationship with Roy Moore where I got pregnant, and ultimately I got an abortion. And again, the idea was get Washington Post to publish this to then say we tricked them and we can't believe any of the women. What did the Washington Post do? Well, they investigated the claims and they started to see them as sort of suspect. They thought maybe this is a fake story. First, the Washington Post noticed that there were some inconsistencies in the woman's story. And then they went online and they found an internet posting from a woman who said, basically, I'm moving to New York. I've accepted a job working in the conservative media movement to combat the lies and deceit of the liberal mainstream media. I'll be using my skills as a researcher and fact checker to help our movement. And the Washington Post research team had reason to believe that that post was from the woman that met with them. And it's kind of weird if you say, well, I'm moving to New York to work in conservative activism. And right after you move to New York, what you do is call up the Washington Post and say, hey, Roy Moore sexually assaulted me when I was 15. So the Washington Post goes and confronts the woman and she insists, listen, I'm not working with anyone. I'm just a woman telling my story of sexual assault. Well, Washington Post was getting more and more suspicious. So they started sort of paying attention to where it was that the woman was going. What is it that she's doing during the day? And they caught her walking into the office of none other than James O'Keefe's Project Veritas. So then the Washington Post says, let's confront James O'Keefe about this woman. And here is what happened when the Washington Post tried to get James O'Keefe to tell them, hey, is this woman working for you? Because she came to us and said Roy Moore sexually assaulted her.
Thank you very much, so have a great day.
Well, I have a question for you guys.
No, that's okay. Thank you.
Well, here's the deal. So the other night, Wednesday night in Virginia, there was a woman who approached...
Do you like our utilizing our techniques? Have you been inspired by Project Veritas?
No, we just wanted to confirm that the woman we believe is Jamie Phillips works for Project Veritas. She showed up here this
I
morning.
think it's really cute that you guys are borrowing our techniques.
So, just wanted to talk to you about.
So it was a design then?
We're busy right now.
Well, here's the problem.
We're running through a meeting.
Someone
Here's the problem.
approached the Washington Post reporter
Yeah.
saying
Here's the
that she was
problem.
impregnated by Roy
Here's
Moore.
the problem.
Was that truthful or was
Here's
that
the problem.
not?
The problem is we're busy. So if you'd like to make an appointment, please call our office and make an appointment.
Okay, I can do
Thank
that.
you.
So
When
we
can we talk
actually-
today?
Thank you.
If you're not involved, you pretty easily just say, no, we don't know who that is. We don't know what you're talking about. You don't do this. And then there was a follow-up, and James O'Keefe was asked, are you working with Roy Moore in some capacity? And he also didn't answer that. So as a result, what has the Washington Post done? Well, they've published the woman's off-the-record comments, which include her original contact with the Washington Post saying she has something, but she needs to keep herself safe. And the entire story just basically completely fell apart. This was a clear sting operation to make the Washington Post seem as though they will report any allegation of sexual assault. And the Washington Post didn't. They investigated and they did the right thing. They were the targets of a sting operation to discredit Roy Moore's accusers. This vindicates the Washington Post. And I can imagine the people at Project Veritas sitting around scheming, thinking, oh, this is just going to be so brilliant. And then it completely blows up in their face. And the real problem, this is what concerns me, is that some people will misunderstand the story and they'll misunderstand the headline, and they will think that the stories about Roy Moore that have previously been published were all false. Because when you look at some of the headlines for this story, a woman approached the Washington Post with dramatic false tales about Roy Moore. If you just read that, and I'm curious, Pat, whether you agree with me about this, might you not come away thinking that all of the stories we've heard so far are the fake ones, when the truth is this makes those other stories more believable?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one thing to go out there and try to discredit the mainstream media.
Sure.
So many people don't like them to begin with.
Easy
But
target.
when you're trying to discredit previous sexual misconduct allegers, that's horrible.
You are going and specifically trying to say, however, what have all 5 or 6 gone through the Washington Post? I don't even know at this point. The idea is to cast doubt upon how truthful the original accusers are, because it was the Washington Post that made some of those reports. And the truth is, we now can trust the Washington Post more than maybe we did. And we should be skeptical of every media outlet, of course. But the fact that the Washington Post didn't just rush and say, hey, here's another one, let's publish this one too. They actually investigated and they said, you know what? This was an attempt to sting us. And they don't do it the way that the right wing says they do it. Number one, that's why this didn't work. And number two, this is why it's particularly ridiculous for Trump to write off the New York Times and the Washington Post as fake news left-wing bomb throwers. Washington Post did the exact right thing here, and I applaud them for it 100%. Here's the backstory on what's going on with net neutrality. And this latest bit of news about Comcast is exactly what I've been predicting for years, and many others. We told you yesterday, Donald Trump has selected months ago Ajit Pai to run the FCC. He's a former Verizon lawyer, and he is now putting forth, actually acting on, a full repeal of the net neutrality regulations that were passed under President Obama. And I spent some time yesterday on the program telling you many of the reasons why this is a veritable disaster. And I mentioned that those opposed to the repeal, those opposed to net neutrality are mostly big internet and telecom companies, their executives, their lobbyists, that the public by and large, to the extent that they understand what net neutrality is hugely in favor of net neutrality. Now, companies like Comcast and other internet service providers have been saying for years, don't worry, consumers, just because we could do all of these really bad things if net neutrality were repealed, we're not going to do them. We have no plan to do those things, so you don't have to worry. And Comcast is one of those, right? For years, Comcast has been lobbying against internet service providers being classified as common carriers, for example. That's a key provision of net neutrality. And they've been saying endlessly, we have no plan to create internet slow lanes and fast lanes, or to charge certain companies more to have their content delivered at speed. The line from Comcast and others has been super clear from the beginning, which is be against net neutrality with us, because we would never do all these bad things that we would be allowed to do if net neutrality were repealed. And in fact, there's a quote from David Cohen, who's a Comcast senior executive VP. Back in May of 2014, he said, quote, "To be clear, Comcast has never offered paid prioritization. We are not offering it today. And we're not considering entering into any paid prioritization, creating fast lanes with content owners." That promise is now gone from Comcast's website. And in fact, it went away a couple of months ago when they started very aggressively pushing the new Ajit Pai Trump FCC to repeal net neutrality. They saw an opening once Donald Trump became president and put Ajit Pai in the FCC. And they quietly removed that promise from their website. And instead now they are promising, number one, they won't discriminate against lawful content, which is meaningless, right? What does it mean? You won't discriminate against lawful content. That just means that you're not going to discriminate against content that has not yet been found to be illegal by a court of law. It's a distraction, actually, from net neutrality. And they are now promising not to impose anti-competitive paid prioritization. That is a key word, because who decides whether the paid prioritization is anti-competitive? Comcast decides. As soon as net neutrality is repealed, Comcast can say, hey, we offer internet fast lanes, but not anti-competitive ones. For example, if Comcast decides to charge Netflix way more money to be delivered at speed to consumers, they might say, listen, it's not anti-competitive because Netflix has a lot of money. It's not an undue burden onto them, which of course ignores the reality that if that's done to Netflix, more than likely, they would pass that cost along to you and me, all of the Netflix subscribers. And the other realization that we all need to come to is that it doesn't matter what companies like Comcast said before, or even what they say now. There's no law that says they can't change their plan, right? Which is why we need to be concerned only with what would they be allowed to do. This is a regular thing in contract law, employment contract, all sorts of contracts. Lawyers start talking to each other, and they're talking mostly about actions that neither of the parties to the contract would ever take deliberately anyway. But the problem is, what would a contract allow someone to do? That is the liability, and that is why we shouldn't worry at all. And by worry, I mean pay attention to what Comcast says they would or wouldn't do, because what we need to be concerned with is what would they be allowed to do. And I wouldn't be surprised if Comcast has their new pricing models ready to go already that include different tiers of internet access or whatever the case may be. You know, these companies have been planning for what seems to be an inevitable repeal of net neutrality. I hope I'm wrong about that, but I think I'm right, sadly. And you need to remember that fast lanes are only fast relative to slow lanes. And unless you slow something down, there's no need to pay to speed it up. And that's what we all need to remember when we think about the entire concept of internet fast lanes and slow lanes. This is a real concern. This is a crisis situation, and I don't want to understate that in any way. Send me your thoughts about this. I'm on Twitter at @DPakman, and the show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Kenneth Cusick. Kenneth Cusick, thank you so much for being a David Pakman Show member. We are truly independent, audience-supported media. Two best ways to support. Number one, do what Kenneth did. Go to davidpakman.com/membership and sign up. Number two, go to patreon.com/davidpakmanshow and make a pledge of as little as $1 a month. Any amount is welcome. And lastly, davidpakman.com/cryptocurrency to contribute via Bitcoin, Ethereum, or Litecoin. Thanks to everybody who has already done that. You can tell a lot about a presidential administration from who they hire, but you can also tell a lot about an administration from who quits. And now Donald Trump's White House ethics lawyer has quit. which is hugely shocking because who could have possibly imagined that Donald Trump even had an ethics lawyer and was still doing all the things that he's been doing? But he did. His name still is, but he's no longer the ethics lawyer, James Schultz. James Schultz has resigned, done dealing with Donald Trump's ethical and financial disclosure issues. He's moving to the, I guess, less stressful job of private law practice. I believe in Philadelphia is where he previously worked. He says that it has nothing to do with the permanent insanity of the Trump administration. I don't personally believe that. I don't know of a rational person who would leave a job that's going great in the White House after just 10 months or so, although Schultz has been quoted as saying, oh, it's completely typical for people to stay in these positions 12 to 18 months. That may be true. We're only 10 months into this administration, and it's going to have to be the Republican National Committee or Fox News or some Republican lobbying firm. They'd better get this guy with some huge bogus salary ASAP so that he doesn't feel inclined to come clean about the atrocities he witnessed while representing Donald Trump's ethics in the White House. And I mostly get the picture that he just wasn't getting paid enough to deal with this degree of insanity. His salary, I believe, was $140,000. And compared to what he could likely be making in private law practice at relatively less stress, probably wasn't making it worth it to stay in this position. Seriously, though, why would Donald Trump need an ethics lawyer? His ethics or his personal philosophy, as I've said before, is greed and personal self-enrichment, period. There really aren't other considerations. And the idea of an ethics lawyer saying to Trump, Mr. President, what you're proposing to do could really appear to be a conflict of interest because of X, Y, Z. That just doesn't even rate with Trump in my mind. I imagine Trump looking kind of like your dog looks when it hears your voice come out of the answering machine.
Yeah.
Where it just kind of what are you saying? A conflict of interest? I don't even understand why that matters.
Well, that reminds me, when the cat's away, the mice will play.
Yes.
So now I'm worried that people in the White House are going to start doing all sorts of unethical things.
Yeah, if you thought Trump was unethical with a White House ethics lawyer following him around, proverbially or literally, then just wait until I don't expect this position to be filled super soon. I don't know that lawyers are necessarily super eager to become Trump's ethics advisors.
They'll take their time on this one.
They'll take it, like with many others, this is one that they're going to take their time on. Being Trump's White House ethics lawyer is kind of like working in the gender non-discrimination department of Fox News or something like that. It's a pointless job, and I imagine that it's also a futile job. Anyway, he's gone. James Schultz is gone. Never knew the guy, low-paid intern, never gave us any advice worth taking, and he's now at a failing fake news law firm of some kind, and we're just going to focus on making America great again. Nobody knows who this guy even was, but he's gone, and we'll never hear from him again unless he decides to show up on Fox News or CNN and start telling us, airing some of the dirty laundry of Donald Trump. I can't believe we're doing this, but we have to. Remember the Access Hollywood grab him by the you-know-what tapes of Donald Trump that set off that firestorm? The recording ended up getting Billy Bush fired from television, but it didn't stop Donald Trump from becoming president of the United States, which is weird. And you'll remember that Trump admitted that it was him on the tapes, right? Trump admitted it was him. He apologized for what he described as locker room talk on the tape. And generally, you don't apologize for something you never did. Now, Donald Trump is questioning whether the tapes are actually authentic or whether they've been doctored. We learned over the Thanksgiving holiday that earlier this year, Donald Trump told a U.S. senator that the Access Hollywood tapes might not be authentic. He recently repeated the exact same claim to an advisor. And Access Hollywood, understandably, had to respond and say, no, the tape is completely real. They said on a recent broadcast, let us make this perfectly clear. The tape is very real. Remember, his excuse at the time was locker room talk. He said every one of those words. I want to remind you again, Trump already admitted that it's his voice on the tapes and apologized for what he said. How do you go from apologizing for it to say there was never anything real to apologize for in the first place? Here's just a little bit of that apology that Donald Trump issued.
I've said and done things I regret, and the words released today on this more than a decade-old video are one of them.
Right.
Anyone who knows me knows these words don't reflect who I am. I said it, I was wrong, and I apologize.
Wow.
I've traveled the country talking about change for America.
That's pretty definitive. I said it, I was wrong, and I apologize. That apology was over something fake that never happened. Now, there are a couple of reasons why Trump might do this. The easiest and the simplest is he's completely narcissistic and thinks that maybe it's been long enough that somebody might start to believe him that, hey, the tapes were doctored. The second option is that it's part of this four-dimensional chess that Trump plays, meant to distract from something else or create media mayhem. Who knows? That's another possibility. I would question whether Trump even can play regular chess, never mind 4D chess. A third option, which is similar to the 4D chess option, but not quite as refined, is that Trump has learned that there could be even worse stuff coming out at some point in the future, and that he's laying the groundwork to question the authenticity of all of it. And I don't know what those recordings might be. We did hear before the election about Tom Arnold said he had some recordings related to The Apprentice, when Donald Trump was on The Apprentice, and that supposedly the stuff he did behind the scenes at The Apprentice blows out of the water the Access Hollywood tapes. We never heard more about that. It's a possibility that Trump is laying the groundwork and kind of preemptively playing defense for when those come out. And that really gets us to the actual tragedy in this, which is, and it pains me to say this, it really does. Some of Trump's supporters are going to eat this up and believe it 110%. There is a group of Trump supporters that has such cognitive dissonance when it comes to Trump the hero versus Trump the serial sexual assaulter, that they will hear Donald Trump question the authenticity of a tape that he's not only acknowledged the truth of, but also apologized for, and they will start to repeat it and say, hey, Trump said it, the tape is fake. And those are the people, Pat, that will never abandon the guy, and we need to forget about them when we think about winning elections in the future.
Well, I mean, how many times has Trump contradicted himself, and how many times has he peddled conspiracy theories?
And it doesn't
He's just
matter.
putting those two things together.
Absolutely. So that is the most disturbing part of it, that even though it is so transparent, so pathetically bogus what Donald Trump is saying here, that the tapes might not be authentic, it has always worked. It has always worked for Trump, and it will continue to work for Donald Trump. And that's why we need to go around Trumpists to win elections in the United States, special elections in 2017, midterms in 2018, and the general election in 2020. Discuss this with us on our Reddit discussion forum. Many of you are, nearly 5,000 of you now, on our Reddit discussion forum at davidpakman.com/REDDIT.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to be joined today by Neil Howe, who is an author, demographer, managing director of Demography at Hedgeye Risk Management, and the man who coined the term millennial. You may also recognize his last name from Strauss-Howe generational theory, and we'll talk about how that connects to some modern political happenings as well. Neil, it's so great to have you on. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
So let's talk a little bit about Strauss-Howe generational theory. For people who may be uninitiated in that, generally speaking, when did you start researching that, and how did you develop that theory?
We started working on this in the late 1980s. We did a very large book project, really retelling all of American history from the 17th century on, from the viewpoint of separate kind of collective generational biographies. And that book was published in 1991. It was called Generations, The History of America's Future. We did another book on Generation X, and then in 1997, we did a book called The Fourth Turning, which revisits generational theory, but looks at it a little bit more explicitly in terms of social and political and cultural cycles generated by this sort of, collective biographical change. And that is probably the book that people remember most in terms of predictions we made about where America's going, and for that matter, much of the world.
And it's based on the idea of 4 roughly 20-year stages that recur in a sort of cyclical way. Can you talk to us a little bit about the 4 stages?
Yes, there are 4 different kinds of generations. We call them archetypes, and some like boomers, I think all Americans today are familiar with them, are born right after crises, indulgently raised, and they come of age with the great awakenings of American history, these great kind of cataclysmic and often somewhat violent or acrimonious breaks in our culture and values. And then there are other types of generations, like what we call the hero archetype, which is protectively raised right after an awakening and typically comes of age during the great crises of our history. But it's interesting that American history has these regular rhythms of kind of times when we remake the inner world and remake the outer world. The great political and civic crises of our history have all been separated by about the length of a long human life, about 80 or 90 years. And roughly in between, halfway in between, we have the great kind of cultural upheavals, the remakings of our inner world, the great awakenings. We used to even number them, first great awakening, second great awakening, third, and so on. And that gives rise to a alternating series of kind of seasons of history. First turning when institutions are strong, individualism is weak, society feels a great sense of collective momentum toward the future. And then the second turnings are the great awakenings, when people tire of all the social discipline and the conformity and try to refine themselves. These are the great individualizing periods of our history. The third turning, when institutions are discredited and individualism is flourishing, government, we enjoy periods of weak government, weak regulation. These are the great periods of sort of free agency in American history, often periods of very high immigration. And then ultimately, this concludes with a kind of a winter season, if you will, of crisis, of outer world change. This is when we kind of tear down and rebuild the realm of politics, economy, and empire. And these are often periods of total war in American history.
How far back does this 4-stage cycle fit into American history?
Well, actually in the fourth turning, we take it all the way back to the late Middle Ages with sort of Anglo-American history. In generations, we really started with sort of the Armada crisis, which came right before the epic confrontation between England and Spain, which happened just before the Puritan generation was born, who actually constituted the Great Migration to New England in the 1630s. But ever since then, we've had probably the first great global war in Western history. It was the War of Spanish Succession and the Glorious Revolution in England, which certainly involved the colonies. A lifetime after that, we had the American Revolution. Lifetime after that, we had the Civil War. We had World War II and the Great Depression, and now here we are.
So we'll get to Stephen Bannon in a bit, but before that, I'd be curious to hear from you. Depending on what you read, you see that there are some who tend to be more social conservatives who evaluate your theory and say, oh, that means we might be getting close to sort of getting back to the social conservatism of the 40s and 50s. And then you also see some liberals who will interpret your theory and say, oh, we might be getting ready to move away from the sort of Reagan-Bush deregulation and get back into something that will appeal more to social progressives. Where do you assess that we are right now?
I assess that you could interpret it either way, because in fact, these fourth turnings tend to be accompanied by a kind of a traditionalism or classicism, or if you want to define a conservatism, the culture, but definitely toward a movement left or in the populist or authoritarian direction in the economy. So, depending on your politics, you could be on the left or on the right and either look favorably on this or not. fourth turnings tend to redefine what we mean by left and right. And I think part of that redefinition is already going on today, particularly since the last election.
Well, to talk about that a little bit, I mean, I guess to get us into the entire Steve Bannon thing, for people who don't know, Steve Bannon, I guess, is a sort of a scholar or student of your theory, although not a personal student of yours, as I'm sure you'll tell us. How did you first come to know that Strauss-Howe generational theory was of interest to Stephen Bannon?
I don't know. It goes back many years. I think he first contacted us maybe 8 or 9 or 10 years ago. I didn't know who he was, so I don't think I ever got back to him. He was a film director in L.A. And I think what people don't realize is that since his Goldman Sachs days, he's really been involved in entertainment and the media. I mean, that's really what interests him. Direction in the pop culture. He's not primarily oriented around political principle or religion. He has a flair or an instinct for where the culture is going, and he particularly as it's interpreted through entertainment, video games, media, and so forth. But anyway, he later on did a documentary called Generation Zero, which I agreed to participate in a bit. I thought it was an interesting thesis, and he's done a fair amount of directing since then, and I've met with him a number of times on that.
Is your sense that the way in which his interpretation of your theory, as it applies to thinking about how he advised the Trump campaign, is it true in some way to how you develop this? Do you see it as a departure or perversion or misinterpretation of your theory? I mean, what are your thoughts now that we know that this was has so informed how he has sort of entered politics over the last years?
It's definitely a sensationalization or popularization of what we did. There's no question about that. But it's interesting that his loyalty, as undoubtedly you know, since you've been following him, is not really to the Trump administration. And he said that several times. He doesn't really care where Trump is going. He is dedicated to the formation of this new populist movement, this populist party. If the GOP is a good vehicle for that, then fine. He thinks that's, a good bet for him now. But if it isn't, he'll find some other way to do it. I guess what I mean to say by that is he's not looking at this as a tool to revitalize the GOP. I honestly don't think he cares too much about what happens to the Republican Party.
Well, aside from viewing it as a tool, I mean, can it even really be a tool in the sense that if there are these roughly 4 20-year periods that lead to a single 80-year cycle, if that is some sort of natural place that society settles in, can you really do anything about that? In other words, would knowledge of that really allow you to change the course of that? Or do you believe that that's just the natural course of things, regardless of people's awareness of it or not?
Well, it's interesting. If you view history as being in some respects or in some aspects of it cyclical, and by the way, this was the ancient belief, before the rise of monotheistic religion and so on. All traditional societies, all pre-modern societies saw time as basically cyclical, and you didn't try to change it. You tried to perform well within it. Mm-hmm. And I think that actually gives you a good guide as I look back on history. It's not so much that you can avoid the turnings. You can't suddenly try to imagine that the awakening isn't going to happen or that a fourth turning mood will not happen. I think then what you focus on in terms of your own choices, how do you make this end well, right? How does every actor play their roles well so that it ends most happily and productively and fruitfully for all involved, as opposed to being a truly horrible and destructive cataclysm, which all of us want to avoid.
What would you see today as sort of a key distinguisher between the millennial and following generation and the older generations within the sort of a political economy, I guess I would say, in the way that it would impact elections? Is there some key difference other than just age and interests, for example, or how they choose to spend their money, the simple stuff that we read articles about all the time, that you think really distinguishes the younger generations from the older generations alive today?
Well, one of the things we see with millennials, and by the way, this is not just here in the United States, this is in Britain, this is in Europe, and this is in East Asia. You see this, is an attraction to sort of one-size-fits-all solutions, kind of populist/authoritarian solutions which remake institutions which work well for their future. It's interesting today in Southeast Asia, for example, you see the young hugely supporting these new charismatic authoritarian populist leaders like Narendra Modi in India, Xi Jinping in China, Shinzo Abe in Britain, in Japan, and Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines. All of these leaders were disproportionately favored by young people. I mean, the young Filipinos have voted in Duterte. Young Chinese now are hugely supportive of Xi Jinping. They're all trying to get into the Communist Party, whereas 20 years ago they weren't. You see that too. And all of these leaders, by the way, are trying to orient their new definition of nationalism around the kind of the main cultural, social, religious mainstream of their country. You look at Europe right now with the new identitarian movement. You know, we've gone from identity politics in the 60s to identitarianism in the 2010s. And I think that's a telling shift. And we see in America, where millennials were hugely in favor of you know, on the here you see it on the left, which was Bernie Sanders, as well as in, you know, the Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, who got an absolutely epic shift toward young voters when he said, I think we should make tuition free and invest hugely in infrastructure. Here's the problem, is that millennials around the world, they're looking, particularly in liberal democracies, they are seeing older individualistic leaders like boomers fail at the basic tasks of governance. They have no focus on the future. They're not even discussing, much less coming to terms with any issue that affects their, you know, their long-term prospects. Another interesting figment of this, or another outgrowth of this, that if you look at millennials around the world, what they think of China, right? Now, older people, when you ask them, there's a Pew study that really documents this well. Older people think, well, China, they really don't approve of it. It's an authoritarian regime. They crush dissidents and so on. We think that's bad. The millennials around the world thinks China's pretty neat. I mean, they invest, you know, 40% of the national income in the future. They're building 250-mile-an-hour bullet trains. You know, they make the trains run on time, and they, you know, it's kind of, that's a society that works. So here's what I see, and people sometimes ask me, how do you know that a society is moving from a, you know, post-war mood to a pre-war mood, right? And that's kind of hard to tell before there's another war or before another civic crisis of some kind. I would say a good clue is to the respective attitudes of young and old toward institutional authority and social order. In a post-war era, it's the old people who actually just went through the civic crisis who are supportive of civic order, and it's the young people who resent it, who you know, rebel against it and so forth. And of course, that's what we had earlier in the post, you know, World War II era. You know, you're going to a pre-war era when the older people are the, you know, great defenders of libertarianism and individualism and everyone's, you know, right to due process, and sort of basically sealing off their rights or their entitlements to whatever wealth and power older people are enjoying. And it's the younger people who become more in favor of government, strong government that actually works, gets things done, and actually, you know, shifts things more in their direction, that is to say, toward the future. And I think that's what we're beginning to see around much of the world today. It's manifesting itself on the left or on the right, depending on which country you look at.
We've been speaking with Neil Howe. He is an author, demographer, managing director of demography at Hedgeye Risk Management. Neil, thanks so much for talking to me today.
You're welcome.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So we're back from Thanksgiving, and whether you did the Black Friday shopping thing or you did the Black Friday don't buy anything thing, that's what I did. I actually have something for you starting today that I think you're really going to like, and it's not something you're going to throw out after 2 days. It's something you will actually use for an entire year, the year of 2018. We have done David Pakman Show calendars for years. We did a 2015 calendar. We did a 2016 calendar. We did a 2017 calendar, each time with greater and greater success. And a few weeks ago, I mentioned I don't really have plans to do one for 2018. Things have been so hectic. We've been dealing with YouTube demonetization. We lost our Amazon affiliate link. I started the Patreon fundraiser. I'm teaching at Boston College. It's just been way too hectic to do a calendar. Haven't even had time to think about it. But I received a bunch of emails from people saying, David, when will the 2018 calendars be available? I really want a 2018 calendar. And I can tell you that thanks to the great work of 3 David Pakman Show viewers, Dan Burke, Corey Topkiss, and Anthony Petramala, who has helped with the calendar, by the way, since the first year we did it, the 2015 calendar, the 2018 David Pakman Show calendar is now available. This is the cover which we're showing you. And on the cover, you see cartoonifications of me, Donald Trump, Steve Bannon, Kellyanne Conway, and Vladimir Putin. And it is all original artwork. And it is such, I actually believe this may be the best calendar yet, because over time, we get a better and better sense of what makes a good calendar. And there's a couple of options for getting it. All of them are available at davidpakman.com/calendar18. Now, let me just restate, because sometimes we have issues with this. It's davidpakman.com/calendar18, not calendar 2018. Okay, davidpakman.com/calendar18. Couple of options, and you'll see them on the website, davidpakman.com/calendar18. Number one, you can get the calendar with a yearly membership for free. Okay, it's got to be a yearly membership, and you have to use the link at davidpakman.com/calendar18. If you use that option, if you get the calendar for free with a membership, it comes autographed automatically for free. Now, if you just want the calendar, there's also a link to that at davidpakman.com/calendar18. You can get just the calendar, either autographed for a little bit more. It's a fundraiser after all. Come on, play along. Or not autographed. And free shipping within the United States. International shipping is extra. Now, a common question is, if you already have a membership, what do? Well, you can decide. If you've just created a yearly membership, you might say, oh, I'll just get the calendar alone. And there's a members only discount for the calendar, which we'll talk about on the bonus show. And you can decide to go about it that way. Or if you're like on a monthly membership, or your yearly membership maybe is almost over, you can cancel your existing membership, restart your membership, and get the calendar for free. The art is really, really great. Dan Burke did his great original cartoons. We have one example that we're showing our television audience. These are completely original. Some of them involve David Pakman as a character. This particular strip, I've grown a big beard, and there's a whole storyline behind that. It's really, really good stuff. Corey Topkiss also did some really great art, including one piece that's sort of Andy Warhol-esque, which was then modified by Anthony Petramala, edited and built upon. And it's a really, really funny and good calendar. So check it out, davidpakman.com/calendar18. A real conversation starter. I assure you, if you put this thing up on your fridge, if you have people who go to your house sometimes, or inside your office or your cubicle, people write to me and they say, I have a lot of conservative people that work with me, and they walk by my cubicle and they see my calendar and it looks interesting. So they get closer and they start looking at it. And I just see their faces drop because of all the liberal propaganda on the calendar.
Yeah, I mean, the holidays are coming up too. What
Yes.
a better gift than to give your Trump-supporting family members.
These make perfect gifts, actually, for Trump-supporting family members and really for anybody. It's a great gift. So please check it out, davidpakman.com/calendar18. The audience is bigger than ever this year than it's been in the past. So speaking merely mathematically, we should be able to sell more calendars than ever before. Other big news for the David Pakman Show. I love having positive news lately because 2017 has had a lot of really, really bad news. The big news is that the David Pakman Show podcast is now on Spotify. If you go to Spotify, either mobile or desktop, and search for the David Pakman Show, you will find the David Pakman Show podcast. Really big deal. Spotify was initially mostly just music. It has grown to include podcasts. It is becoming a major podcast platform, and not everybody can just put their podcast on Spotify. We were actually invited to put the David Pakman Show on Spotify, and we are now on iTunes, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, and Spotify, and you can follow us there. Really, really great stuff. So I'm excited about this. I love it when we get on a platform I use, and I use Spotify all the time.
Really?
When I'm at the gym, I'm listening to music and podcasts on Spotify, and very, very exciting. So that's available. And also, as I mentioned yesterday, Steam It, okay? You can support the show merely by upvoting our content, and you can make some money yourselves by going to steemit.com. That's STEEMIT.com. Create an account. Takes a couple days for it to be verified, but don't get put off by that. And then follow us, steemit.com/@David Pakman, @David Pakman. And just by upvoting our content, you will be supporting the work we do. So really good stuff. It's good to have good news, because between demonetization on YouTube and the destruction, as I call it, the elimination of our Amazon affiliate link and all of this different stuff, it's nice to have some wins towards the end of the year.
We like to keep it light, with the Jenga segment,
Yes,
the
of
Patriot
course.
Mail. This is great news as well.
Yes, and by the way, Pat has already committed to buying 150,000 David Pakman Show calendars. We are not going to be including those numbers towards the goal, because it's great that you're picking up all these calendars, but really the idea is for the audience to buy as many as possible. Just
I
so
wanted
you know.
them all for myself.
I know. Well, listen, the great thing is we can get as many calendars as we need, because we have a print supply shop that has unlimited resources.
Okay.
So if everybody wants a calendar, they can get it. And that's another thing I mentioned, davidpakman.com/calendar18 to get the 2018 calendar. Okay, let's go to your voicemails. Voicemail number is 219-2-DAVID-P. You can call any time of day. Many of you do call at very unusual times of day, and that's okay. We heard from the Eggman recently, and the Eggman is pointing out that he believes what Anthony Weiner was found guilty of is not nearly as bad as what Alabama Republican Senate candidate Roy Moore is accused of. Take a listen to what the Eggman said.
Hi, Dave. I think what Roy Moore is accused of doing is so much worse than what Anthony Weiner has been convicted of doing. I don't like all these false equivalences. Well, what about Clinton? What about? But if they want to go that route, what about Weiner? Okay, forget it. Roy Moore is fine. He can do that. But let Weiner out and put him back in government, okay? I want to pull Weiner off the farm team and bring him back out, because he's nothing compared to this scumbag Roy Moore. That's all.
Yeah, we're against the ranking of sexual assault and sex crimes. But that being said, I think you can still draw similarities and differences between different incidents. And I tend to agree with what the Eggman says. I've never defended Anthony Weiner's actions, and I don't. I just don't think they are as bad as what Roy Moore is accused of.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the Anthony Weiner stuff would be a big deal had he not sent images of himself to an underage girl.
No doubt about it. No question about it. So, Eggman, thank you very much for calling in, and you can see what he's thinking about these days. Up there in rural upstate New York.
He also said pull Weiner.
He said, he wants to see Weiner pulled, and that's fine.
That's fine.
Yeah, no big deal. On the bonus show today, why the massacre of Muslims in the Sinai was too extreme even for Al-Qaeda. What does that even mean? We'll also talk about a mysterious object that has been confirmed to be from another solar system, but it's not a UFO. It's just an object from another solar system. We'll talk about that on the bonus show. And are we heading towards YouTube Adpocalypse 2.0? There is a new Adpocalypse scandal over videos sexualizing little kids on YouTube. How are we dealing with this again? This story and others on the bonus show today. Get access by going to davidpakman.com/membership and signing up, or by becoming a $5 a month patron at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. We'll speak to you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.